I am Clara, an investigative journalist with a knack for uncovering stories that many would prefer to keep buried. When I heard rumors about a butcher shop in a small town gaining fame for its incredibly fresh and flavorful cuts of meat, something caught my attention. It wasn't just the quality of the products that sparked curiosity, but also the increase in disappearances in the area, strangely coinciding with the growth of the business. The butcher, Mr. Kessler, at first glance, seemed like just another local merchant, always smiling in his spotless apron with a cordial demeanor. But there was something off about his polished behavior, as if behind that friendly facade lay a dark secret, pulsing deep in his eyes. My investigation started slowly. I interviewed some customers and former employees, trying to piece together the puzzle. Initially, no one had anything negative to say. It was as if the butcher shop was the town's jewel, untouchable. But as time passed, certain details began to stand out, a metallic, almost iron-like smell that lingered around the butcher shop, especially at night, and mysterious deliveries that took place at odd hours, always when the rest of the town was asleep. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that this was no mere coincidence. Something was very wrong behind Mr. Kessler's fame, and I needed to find out before he realized he was being watched. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. Suspicion was building, but I needed concrete evidence to expose what was really happening there. I waited until the lights in the butcher shop went out and the street fell silent. Mr. Kessler had left, or so I thought. I took a deep breath and headed toward the back door, which I managed to unlock after days of observing his routine. Inside the butcher shop, everything looked normal, gleaming counters, well-displayed cuts of meat. But I knew that what I was searching for was hidden somewhere beyond that clean and organized facade. After rummaging through the shelves and opening a few doors, my eyes finally landed on something that sent a chill down my spine, a small lever disguised in the wall. When I pulled it, a mechanical sound echoed, and a passage opened, revealing a staircase that led down to a basement. With my heart pounding, I descended slowly, one step at a time, trying to control my breathing so it wouldn't betray me. The air down there was dense and heavy, and as I went further down, the darkness became almost tangible. When I finally reached the last step, what I saw nearly took my breath away. The space was filled with hooks hanging from the ceiling, swaying slowly, as if they had been used recently. The walls were lined with tools, saws, knives, and cleavers, all stained with something dark and dry. The metallic smell I had sensed before was stronger now, mingling with the repulsive odor of rotten meat and something else, something putrid. In the center of the basement stood a cold storage chamber with large metal doors. I swallowed hard and, gathering all the courage I had, opened one of the doors. My stomach twisted instantly. There were pieces of meat hanging inside, but they weren't from any animal. Arms, legs, and even faces. An indescribable horror unfolded before me, with human parts meticulously separated and labeled, as if they were ordinary cuts. I tried to look away, but my eyes were drawn to a nearby shelf filled with small personal items, watches, bracelets, rings, memories of people who had vanished without a trace. And then, I found something that froze my blood, a folder full of photographs. They were the victims, captured from the moment they entered the butcher shop to their last moments, each marked with notes about weight, height, and flavor. I was trembling, barely able to breathe. I was about to run when a low, calm voice filled the air. I wondered how long it would take for you to discover this. I spun around, and there he was. Mr. Kessler, standing at the foot of the stairs, looking at me with that serene smile that now seemed like a mask of pure terror. "You know, Clara, you really gave me a hard time. Spying, snooping. But that's all right. I already knew you were here. In fact, I've been preparing for your arrival for days." I took a step back, but my back hit one of the hooks, making it sway gently. I was cornered. He took a step forward, raising something that gleamed under the dim light, a massive cleaver with a blade stained red. "Now that you know so much, I guess there's no choice left." His voice was almost sweet as he slowly approached. "You're going to become the next special batch." Terror consumed me, but I knew that if I didn't act quickly, it would be my end. As he took another step toward me, I threw myself to the side, stumbling between the hooks and running into the darkness of the basement. My hands were sweating, slipping on the cold surfaces of the shelves and the frigid walls. I needed to hide. I needed to think. I crouched behind a group of hanging carcasses, forcing my breathing to calm down, trying to muffle the sound of my heart racing uncontrollably. Every muscle in my body was tense as I listened to Mr. Kessler's slow footsteps echoing through the basement. He whistled, a low and disturbing sound that seemed to vibrate in the darkness. He was playing with me. "Clara, Clara, there's no use hiding," he murmured, as if speaking to a naughty child. "I know every inch of this place. I know exactly where you are." I held my breath, biting my lips to keep from making a sound. He passed so close that I could almost feel the warmth of his presence and the metallic odor that clung to his clothes. I waited until he moved away, silently slipping between the hanging meats. Every movement had to be perfect. I had to find a way out, a way to escape. But he was always one step ahead. I tried to maneuver around the shelves, but there he was, smiling in the dark. I tried to change direction, and again I felt his gaze following me. The narrow corridors, filled with hooks and saws, were a true labyrinth of horrors, but he seemed to navigate them like a predator in its natural habitat. My desperation grew with each passing second. I needed to do something. Anything. On an impulse, I peeked through a crack and saw him with his back turned, examining something on one of the counters. It was my chance. Without thinking twice, I lunged forward, grabbing the first thing I saw, a rusty saw. I needed to disarm him. I ran toward him, raising the saw, but he turned at the last second and dodged with terrifying speed. A strong blow hit my arm, making me drop the tool and stumble backward. "Damn it!" I yelled, falling to my knees. He laughed, a low, guttural chuckle that sent chills down my spine. "Good try," he murmured, raising the cleaver. "But you'll have to do better than that." Panic overtook me. There was nowhere left to run, and he was closing in, cutting off any escape route I might have. That's when my eyes landed on the cold storage chamber. If only I could lock him inside. Without thinking twice, I jumped back, throwing myself into the chamber. He lunged forward at the same moment, but I managed to swing the door shut with all my might, feeling it slam shut with a dull thud. I locked it from the inside, my chest rising and falling as I tried to catch my breath. My phone. I still had my phone. With trembling hands, I pulled the device from my pocket and recorded a desperate message. "I'm trapped in Mr. Kessler's butcher shop. He's hunting me. He uses human meat. Please, if anyone finds this, send help." I sent the recording as fast as I could, hoping the signal would be strong enough to get through. But before I could do anything else, a soft and familiar sound came from outside. Mr. Kessler's low laughter. "You think you're safe in there, Clara," he murmured, his voice calm like the dripping of a broken faucet. "With every passing second, that cold makes your flesh more tender." I trembled uncontrollably, not just from the biting cold, but from pure terror. I knew I couldn't stay there for long. He knew every detail of that place, and if he wanted to, he would find a way to reach me. But there was something he didn't know. While I had been exploring the basement, I had noticed a vent at the back of the chamber. A narrow, claustrophobic hole that could lead outside, or trap me further. I had no choice. I crawled toward the vent, my fingers numb from the cold, and began to pull at the grate with all my strength. It gave slowly, making a faint noise. I glanced at the chamber door, expecting him to break it down at any moment, but all I heard was his voice, smooth and unbearably calm. "You know that sooner or later, I'm going to get you." With one last pull, the grate fell. I squeezed through the narrow hole, feeling the cold metal cut into my arms and legs, but I kept crawling, ignoring the pain and the panic. The tunnel seemed endless, but I needed to get out of there. I needed to survive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a small light at the end. A glimmer of hope. I pushed myself toward the exit, every muscle in my body screaming with exhaustion, until I did it. The light flooded my eyes as I emerged into the open air, gasping and bloodied, but alive. Behind me, at the end of the tunnel, the sound I feared the most, the thud of the metal door opening. And then, silence. I have always been a reserved guy, someone of few words, someone who prefers to go unnoticed. When I got a job at the butcher shop of a large supermarket, I saw it as a chance to start over, to move on without being noticed. It wasn't a dream job, but it was honest and kept me busy. I spent the first few days trying to adjust, cutting meat, packaging, and organizing the cuts in the displays while serving customers who came and went without really seeing me. The routine was simple, predictable, and I thought that, finally, I would find some kind of peace there. But soon I realized that something was wrong. The atmosphere in the butcher shop was different from any other place I had ever worked. The air felt heavier, as if each breath brought a sense of restlessness that clung to me and refused to go away. The cold was also abnormal, too biting, even for a place where meat is kept fresh. It was as if it were always the middle of winter, even when the store outside was warm and well lit. But what truly made me uncomfortable were the shadows. At first, I thought it was just fatigue, my mind playing tricks on me as I tried to cope with the intense pace of the new job. I saw them moving in the corners, like dark shapes sliding along the walls or sneaking through the meat shelves. Always at the edge of my vision, as if they were watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. Every time I turned to look closely, they disappeared. And there I would be, alone in the butcher aisle, feeling a strange chill run down my spine. But what could I do? Talk to someone? Tell my boss I was seeing shadows? He would send me straight to a psychologist, and I would definitely lose my job. So, I kept going to work every day, fighting the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I ignored the discomfort and tried to focus on my tasks. But that became increasingly difficult. The silence inside was oppressive, crushing. There were moments when I felt as if the very environment was pressing in on me, as if the walls wanted to swallow me whole. The freezer, in particular, was the worst of all. Always cold, always dark, always waiting. That night, I was alone to close the store. The manager had already left, and the other employees had too. I just needed to organize a few last cuts in the freezer and lock up. It was a simple task, something I had done before. But as I walked through the empty aisles of the supermarket, a growing sense of dread began to consume me. It was an irrational fear, almost suffocating, that made me hesitate in front of the metal door of the freezer. I should have left. Something inside me screamed to just drop everything and get out of there. But I ignored the instinct. After all, it was just a freezer, right? I opened the door and was enveloped by the cold air that rushed out. The familiar smell of raw meat filled my nostrils. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, closing the door behind me. Everything was as it always was, carcasses hanging on hooks, cuts of meat lined up on shelves, the low hum of the compressor buzzing in the background. But there was something more. An even heavier silence. A cold that felt more intense. And then, that feeling, as if I wasn't alone. As if someone, or something, was there, hidden, waiting. It was then that I realized the true terror was just beginning. I entered the freezer carrying a heavy tray of meat, trying to ignore the weight on my head and the uncomfortable feeling that something was watching me. The air inside was even colder than usual, freezing enough to cut through the skin. Everything was shrouded in shadows, the emergency lights flickering softly on the ceiling and casting indistinct shapes among the hanging carcasses. Each step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the absolute silence. My own breathing blended with the distant sound of the compressor buzzing, creating an almost hypnotic sensation of total isolation. The beef carcasses swayed slightly, as if something invisible had just passed by, stirring them. My gaze traveled down the narrow corridor that stretched ahead, intersected by the hooks that swayed gently. I just needed to hang those last cuts, get out, and lock up. But the deeper I went, the darker and more oppressive the atmosphere seemed to become. I turned a corner, trying to ignore the chill that crept up my spine, and then I stopped. My whole body froze in place. There was someone at the end of the corridor. A tall, robust man, wearing a filthy apron, soaked with fresh and dried blood. He stood among the carcasses, as if he were part of the scenery, broad shoulders firm, and enormous hands gripping a cleaver that reflected the cold glow of the flickering lights. The blade gleamed with a metallic sheen, but it was his face that truly terrified me. He wore a crude butcher's mask, covering part of his face and leaving only his eyes visible. Eyes that shone with an insane intensity, filled with something I could only describe as pure sadistic pleasure. He didn't move immediately, he just stared at me, as if studying each of my movements. A cold shiver ran down my spine, freezing every muscle in my body. The air around me seemed to grow even colder, almost as if you were draining the heat from the room itself. My hands were sweaty, making it hard to hold the tray. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but my feet were glued to the floor, as if trapped in ice. Then, he smiled beneath the mask. A wide, distorted smile that made my stomach churn. "I've been waiting for you, Lucas," he whispered, his voice low and drawn out, as if savoring each word. He began to walk slowly toward me, with calculated steps, like a predator approaching its prey. "For days, actually, waiting to meet you up close." My instinct screamed for me to run. I spun on my heels, trying to escape, but before I could take 2 steps, he was already there, blocking the way with a speed that made no sense for someone his size. My heart raced in my chest, panic spreading like fire. "Not so fast," he murmured, raising the bloodied cleaver. "Let's get to know each other a little better first." I tried to back away, but found myself trapped in the maze of hanging meat. With every attempt to dodge, to move away, it seemed he always knew where I was going, moving with impossible agility among the carcasses. The sound of the hooks creaking and metal clinking created a hellish soundtrack for the chase that had just begun. "You know, Lucas," he began casually, as if he were chatting with me on an ordinary afternoon, "that many have gotten lost in here. Employees, people like you, who thought it was just another ordinary job. But it's not." Every word from him was a blow to my sanity, and I could barely breathe. He was getting closer and closer, cornering me between the hooks and the shelves filled with meat. Some, poor souls, never found their way out. They became part of the stock. He laughed, a low, guttural laugh that reverberated through the space. My whole body trembled. I looked around desperately for an exit, but there was none. Just narrow corridors, carcasses swaying gently, and him, getting closer and closer. "Do you know what it feels like, Lucas? The sensation of being hung on one of those hooks? Of becoming part of this place? I can show you. Transform you into the next special cut. Something that everyone will savor without ever knowing what they're really eating." My hands trembled so much that I almost dropped the tray. There was no way to escape. He was everywhere at once, moving like a monstrous shadow that knew every corner of the freezer. I felt the dread growing, crushing any remnants of hope. "So, what do you say?" he continued, raising the cleaver and observing it with fascination. "Do you prefer to be a rib, or a nice filet mignon?" Panic consumed me entirely, and every cell in my body screamed to run, to escape that man, that monster. But I knew that if I simply ran, he would catch me in seconds. I needed to think. I had to use the only resource I had, the freezer itself. Without wasting any more time, I dove between the hanging carcasses, letting the tray drop with a muffled thud on the floor. The cold pieces of meat brushed against my face as I forced myself to maneuver between the metal hooks, hiding in the chaos of swaying flesh. The strong smell of blood and raw fat filled my nostrils, but I kept my breathing steady, doing everything I could to make no noise. Crouched behind a row of carcasses, I peeked through the narrow gaps between them. The butcher stood just a few feet away, his cold, calculating eyes scanning the area. For a second, I thought he might not see me. Maybe I could escape while he searched on the other side. But then he tilted his head to the side, like a dog sniffing something interesting, and began to walk slowly in my direction. "You think you can hide from me, Lucas?" His voice echoed off the cold walls, each word dripping with dark pleasure. "I know every inch of this place, every path, every dark corner." The sound of the hooks creaking filled the air as he pushed a carcass aside, clearing a path through the narrow corridor. My heart pounded so loudly that I was sure he could hear it. With a quick motion, he raised the cleaver and drove it into a piece of meat beside me, the impact echoing through the metal walls. "I will find you. And when I do, I'll hang you right here, next to the others." I held my breath, shrinking even further against the biting cold of the walls. There was no time to think. I needed to act. I grabbed a large piece of meat from a hook and, with all the strength I could muster, threw it to the opposite side. The piece hit the wall with a wet, heavy sound, and the butcher turned toward the noise, his eyes sparkling. Before he could move, I snatched a small knife that was hooked on one of the racks and crawled to the opposite side, silent as a shadow. He advanced toward where the noise had come from, and I seized the moment to crawl among the carcasses, always trying to stay out of his line of sight. Every movement had to be careful, every breath, contained. But he wasn't just looking for me, he was toying with me, savoring every second. Ah, this is exciting, isn't it? A hunting game. He suddenly stopped, turning abruptly. I froze, my body rigid, praying he wouldn't see me. And I've always been very good at hunting. The metal of the cleaver grazed the hooks as he began to move faster. He knew I was close. My terror was blinding me, and I stumbled backward, bumping into one of the hooks. The sound was too loud. I saw his eyes shine with satisfaction as he bolted in my direction. My heart stopped for an instant. I didn't think, I just reacted. I crouched and rolled to the side, dodging through a narrow corridor between the meats. He was right behind me, his heavy footsteps reverberating like a macabre drum. The corridor was narrowing, and I knew I wouldn't be able to keep my distance for long. That's when I saw it, a small opening in the ceiling, almost imperceptible, covered by a vent grate. It wasn't big, but it was my only chance. With my lungs burning, I leaped and grabbed onto the cold metal of the wall, climbing as best as I could. My fingers, numb from the cold, slipped, but I forced myself to keep going, feeling the weight of desperation driving each movement. The blade of the cleaver passed inches from my leg, leaving a line of pain. "You won't escape," he roared, striking the metal with such force that the sound reverberated through the narrow space. I reached out, fingertips brushing the grate. With almost superhuman effort, I pushed the rusty metal, which gave way, opening just enough for me to squeeze my body through. As I pulled myself up, the cold metal felt like it was cutting into my skin. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. He was down there, his eyes wild and his breathing heavy. "You will come back. Sooner or later, everyone comes back." I didn't wait to hear more. As soon as I struggled to get through the opening, I felt the fresh air from outside hit my face. Bleeding and trembling, I crawled through the ventilation system until I found an exit, pushing the grate aside and tumbling awkwardly into the supermarket corridor. I staggered to my feet, my knees weak and my mind numb with fear. But I was alive. Somehow, I had escaped that nightmare. I ran out of the store, my footsteps echoing in the empty aisle, each sound seeming as loud as thunder. When I finally emerged into the parking lot, my breath came in irregular gasps, my chest ached, but I was free. Behind me, the supermarket looked innocuous, but I knew what was hidden inside. I knew he was still there, lurking. With trembling hands, I kept running, daring not to look back. But even from a distance, I could swear I heard the distant sound of hooks swaying and metal clinking softly in the wind. I had escaped by a hair's breadth. But the butcher was still there, and he wouldn't give up so easily.